welcome to the online discourse, Postcolonial Narratives of the Social Standing of Minority Women in South Asia, organized by South Asia Research Institute for Minorities. I'm your host, Rimsha Shahid, Research Analyst at SARIM, and today we have a beautiful and thoughtful mind with us, Miss Zehra Kazmi. She's a PhD student at the School of English, University of St. Andrews. For her doctoral thesis, she is studying historical memory and nostalgia in South Asian Muslim writing in the context of sectarian violence and cultural disintegration in contemporary India. At the intersections of post-colonial theory, memory studies, affect theory, global modernisms, and decolonial feminist thinking, her project examines the works of various South Asian Muslim writers. She is the co-founder of Tasavvur Collective, a consortium of early career researchers interested in the social, historical, and literary representation of South Asian Muslims. In addition to post-colonial writing and South Asian culture, Zehra harbors a keen interest in multiple fields within literary and cultural studies like cinema studies, urban studies, digital narratives, heritage studies, material culture and object narratives, nature writing, intimacy, and feminist theory and oral history. Zara must appreciate that you have very diverse and artistic interests. So yeah, I'm pleased to have you as our guest. I hope this discourse will going to be quite resourceful and informative. I will now begin with my first question. The first question is, while reading your profile, I came to know about Tasavvur Collective. Kindly tell us the idea behind Tasavvur.
First of all, thank you so much, Rimsha, for your generous introduction. I really appreciate that I've been invited by the South Asia Research Institute for Minorities. It's a huge honor to be considered for this, and I'm really grateful that this will hopefully allow some of my ideas to reach to a wider audience. So yeah, thanks a lot for first of all giving me this platform. Now Tasavvur Collective is basically, as you already read a little bit, a consortium that was formed with over Twitter because I have two co-founders for this collective. One is Fatima Zehra Naveed. She is a PhD candidate at the University of Exeter, and the other one is Sheila Lipi Sahana. She is a PhD candidate at the University of Edinburgh, and all three of us kind of work on sort of like the intersections of English lit, because we don't specifically just look at English literature. Linguistically, we look at all three of us look at Urdu writing that emerges from South Asia, from the progressive writers and after the progressive writers, like that period, um, and that kind of and it was just a sort of a like one of those things where you follow someone on Twitter and you think, wow, their work is so interesting and maybe so similar to mine. And I remember messaging Fatima, and she mentioned Sheila to me, and then there was a series of like just casual Zoom calls just to get to know each other and to find out like what we work on. As it is, we were sort of just coming out of the pandemic, so we were probably all feeling a bit isolated. And the conversations we struck were really not just, like really interesting and fun, but we realized that there is scope for a lot of collaboration here. And that led to the creation of the Tasavvur Collective. Um, the collective primarily looks at uh, contemporary Muslim South Asia. Like those are our research interests. And uh, Our first symposium, which was called Writing Muslim Women in South Asia, just happened in August, and we spoke to our supervisors, we spoke to some academics who sort of advised us with maybe starting off with a symposium, and then hopefully sort of branching out to a bigger conference and more events, more online events, more blog posts and things like that. And like with Writing Muslim Women in South Asia, there's this dominant narrative of Muslim women either being extremely sort of, of being extremely oppressed, or there's this Orientalist gaze that Muslim women sort of, feel commodified under or objectified under that comes from the West, and of either extreme oppression or sort of, the modern Muslim woman who's barely Muslim at all, like that sense of who a progressive Muslim woman is. And we wanted to interrogate these binaries and hopefully through this conference bring to this symposium bring to light debates about reform and decolonization and citizenship, which are which are inherent in this long tradition of Muslim women writers that have been present in South Asia, as we find out from, not just from the early modern period, so like literally from the Mughal times, or even before that, and we were interested in sort of thinking about how they navigate this binary of emancipation and oppression. And we had a fantastic turnout. We were sold out on Eventbrite. We had speakers from all over the world join us, from the US, the UK, Trinidad and Tobago, like just different parts of the world, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and people who worked on identities that you wouldn't necessarily see in the mainstream discourse, where like Sri Lankan Muslims or Northeastern Muslims, and in India, and trying to excavate how gender reconfigures and frames these identities in particular nationalist and cultural and religious context. And yeah, we had it was a 3 day symposium. We had 4 keynote speakers who very generously joined us. Lots of very important academics in the field who have done like work, who we didn't even know like would reply to an email, but were like kind enough to join the conference, give us advice, help us organize logistics, and give lots of feedback to a lot of early career scholars who had papers that they were presenting. So it was like a wonderfully collaborative effort, and we hope to do more stuff like this in the coming years.
Must say, pandemic has really yielded positive results for you guys somehow. So while I was reading your profile, I came across a discipline that says memory studies, and I was so curious to know about what sort of discipline, what sort of course it is. So next question is related to this. Your research deals with memory in Indo-Muslim culture in South Asia. Can you tell us more about it and how did you get interested in this topic? Moreover, kindly tell a little bit about memory studies, like what sort of course and discipline it is.
So, okay, memory studies started off, as far as I know, I may be a little bit mistaken, but it started off from the discipline of history and cultural studies in, I would say, the late 20th, say mid to late 20th century. I mean, literature has sort of obviously historically been obsessed with memory, because what is a literary narrative? It is obviously, it's creative. Very often, if you're talking about fiction, it is creative, but it is also built on a post facto recollection of your own experiences in the past, right? And how you choose to narrativize them. And memory studies sort of emerged, uh, I'm pretty sure people were always doing memory studies, but kind of to specifically call it memory studies, I would say, sort of appeared in comparative lit departments in America and Britain. But historians have been doing oral history work for a long time. I'd say the past 3, 4 decades, we've seen sort of the rise of oral history, specifically in the South Asian context. People like Urvashi Butalia did really phenomenal work with, books that became really important, like The Other Side of Silence, which looked at women's accounts of the partition violence. And it sort of started with Urvashi Butalia's own family, and then she expanded it to speaking with Sikh and Hindu and Muslim women who were affected by the partition. Um, uh, you know, um, so memory studies is broadly just that. It is looking at narratives of cultural memory in in popular discourse. So, you can have a memory studies lens. So very, very often it pans out in the sense of looking at a historic event and individual subjective experiences of that, right? So, for instance, in the South Asian context, the partition became a focal point because uh, there were generations who still had some memory of it, and but this process had not sort of been formally academically excavated. People have done this work for the Bangladesh War as well, and looking at accounts of these massive events and individual experiences surrounding that, but possibly how are these events memorialized in our history as well. And we see this with very interestingly, when we think about independence, do we think about the pain and trauma of partition, or do we think about the start of a new era, the birth of a new country, of new countries, and how, or do we think about both when we think about narratives of what was happening in 1947, which is repeated to us every year or almost. So thinking about those narratives and cultural memories, the role of memory studies. Now, there are multiple scholars who are very important in the field. People like Andreas Hussein, people like Marianne Hirsch, would be great starting points. Marianne, a lot of memory studies in the Western academy emerged from uh, looking at the Holocaust and the Second World War. So Marianne Hirsch's work became very important because she coined this term called post-memory, which looked at, the second generation memory. So, for instance, it looked at her. She sort of started. I mean, I think the starting point for her was her own Jewish identity, and I think they were exiled from this town in contemporary Romania, if I'm not wrong. I think it was Romania, maybe miss. I think it's called Cernovitz, and because she's written about it in a book. And she herself was not born there, but her family had so many memories of that place, obviously, because they had to uh, they were exiled. They had to run away from that place with when Hitler came to power. So looking at that impact on a generation that has never lived in that lost home, but whose entire sense of identity is around that lost home. So we see that again in the South Asian context. Very often, in India, I'm Indian, so very often in India you will meet Punjabis in Delhi. Their surnames are distinctly Punjabi, Malhotra, Verma, or some Khatri surname possibly. So you would assume that they are Punjabi or have Punjabi ancestry. And if you speak to them, they will say, I don't know Punjabi as much now because we speak Hindi. And if you ask them where they come, but they will describe themselves as Punjabi. If you ask them, oh, where in Punjab, they'll say, हम लाहौर से आए थे या हम पिंडी से आए थे. With like they clearly these, if I'm talking to a 20-year-old, a 25-year-old, a 30-year-old, they have never experienced being from Pindi or being from Lahore in their lifetimes. Maybe even their parents have not, but they choose to describe themselves as coming from these parts of the world, coming from the other side of the border. So certainly their sense of, I mean, there's a very interesting study of with the partition, obviously, we think of Punjab as like this homogeneous sort of Punjabi identity when there are multiple languages that were, dialects that were spoken there. Quite importantly, Saraiki, for instance, which is sort of a dialect that is spoken sort of in the part of Punjab that borders Sindh, if I'm not wrong. And they have a slightly different cuisine. They have a slight, different language, the kind of Punjabi they speak. And very often that's not necessarily represented in our Indian narrative of what Punjab is like, or what we think Punjabi language sounds like. But there are still these pockets of Delhi, and I was that's why I mean I did my undergrad in Delhi, and I'm eternally fascinated by the city. Um, there are these pockets of people who still speak Saraiki, who still cook like this specific Saraiki dal, which is not no longer sort of you know uh, which is not cooked in other Punjabi households. Um, and I think in North Delhi, a lot of them were refugees who were resettled after the partition. Um, and I think it's interesting how sometimes, communities hold on to certain aspects of their identity. Uh, these refugee communities might, even if possibly, that may not be as strong, and maybe even those Punjabis were still in that part of Pakistan where they came from. So I think that's again very interesting how cultures and communities hold on to memory becomes very important as well. And my supervisor in India, Rai Chaudhary, has done very interesting work in this field because his book called Homemaking um looks at uh, uh, looks at British South Asians and how they built a home in the UK, and how did and the process was of creating little Pakistans, little Punjabs, little UP, little Bengal in their little neighborhood in somewhere in Britain, like serving, cooking diasporic food, like trying to replicate flavors. Um, and I've always been very fascinated by this process of thinking about memory, and I don't know how it started. It started very yeah, it started quite randomly because I became obsessed with how in my life I would talk to people and talk about an event or something that happened in the past, and I would have a slightly different memory from what they might remember, how that day panned out. Oh, we went to that restaurant, didn't we? And they'd say, no, we went somewhere else. Or they might say, oh my God, I have no memory of this. I don't remember this entire day that happened like 4 years ago, but you remember it so clearly. And I was very interested by these individual variations in our memory of an event or of a moment in time, and how they can sometimes clash with each other. And we've all experienced this in our lives. Like, this is not something that is unique to me. We've all had these moments where we might remember something very differently from how another person would choose to narrativize it. Um, and I became interested in this disjunct that happens, or in these multiple narratives that happen. And very often, obviously, uh, people are interested in seeing, like, trying to figure out the truth between these two or three or very different versions of the same event. But I became interested in I mean, and I do think there is maybe a place for that in certain scenarios. But I personally became interested in the fabric that forms these memories. Like, why, how do people narrativize them? How do they paint a picture? What are the ways in which they distinguish from each other? Can I, as a researcher, um, you know, do I have any insight on why people might have differing memories of a particular moment in history, or a particular event? And I think was always that was just something that I found very interesting. So even reading when I was very young, like reading books that I don't know, I don't know if they're as good as how I found them at that age. I remember reading Perks of Being a Wallflower when I was like very like 13 or something, being extremely impressed. But just this idea that he had these repressed memories of abuse, and he had like sorry, spoiler alert, but or thinking about how people have hidden memories, repressed memories, memories they choose to hide, they choose to not acknowledge to themselves, not acknowledge to others, trauma. The those That idea was again, it's often repeated in literature and cinema, and I think that I definitely caught on to that. and became quite fascinated by that idea. So that was sort of, sorry, the general idea of like why I'm interested in memory. But I found it interesting that people have chosen to, across generations, memorialize that history. And I found that Indo-Muslim culture, not just in my home, but how it's represented in cinema, how it's represented in books, has this degree of pathos in it. There is a certain tragedy, a tragic lens through which uh, Muslims are understood, in particularly in the Indian narrative of like lost culture, disintegrating culture. Particularly with Muslim women, again, like sort of being seen as people from another time, another era, women who were shy and followed these sort of almost antiquated codes of modesty and spoke in very rich, old-fashioned Urdu. When this is clearly just a very limited and notion of what a Muslim woman is like. Muslim women are of all types. They speak many, many languages that are not just Urdu. And even if they speak Urdu, they don't necessarily recite shares with every sentence that comes out of their mouth. And I was interested in this representation of really nostalgic Muslims in literature and culture. And I think I came across this book when my undergrad ended called Sunlight on a Broken Column by Atya Hussain, and reading it sort of opened my eyes and changed that told me that this hunch I had that I in the back of my mind, like there is a literary culture that I can examine. And then it sort of got me started on this trajectory of looking at a lot of different books and writers. And that's how I came to this PhD. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
I believe that cultural identities are hard to worn out, and I certain people, specifically from diasporic community, they really yearn to feel relatable, to feel related to their culture. So the discipline, the course
Absolutely.
seems very interesting to me. Your profile also says that your project also examines the work of certain Muslim writers. So next question is regarding this. Who are the Muslim women writers your research is looking at? What is uniquely interesting about their work?
So, Muslim womanhood is definitely a big part of my thesis. I have a chapter dedicated to Muslim women writers, and I'm, and examining them particularly. My master's thesis, though, while I was doing my master's, I wrote my master's thesis was about uh, looking at the construction of Muslim womanhood in colonial India and anglicized Indo-Muslim womanhood. And I think, if I'm not wrong, I think my paper was called something misfits. The idea of the Muslim woman, the educated Muslim woman as a misfit. And I examined Sunlight on a Broken Column, which is the book I just mentioned by Atya Hussain, and Ismat Chughta's Teri Lakir, or The Crooked Line in English. And these both these books were account, although very different in the way that they were structured and written, of women who are from the first generation that comes out of Parda, and how they engage with, how they forge their own independence um, in an India that is rapidly changing and hurtling towards independence, and also the partition. So, how do you frame the identity of a modern Muslim woman when especially in the Indian context, the identity of Muslim sort of starts being othered uh, because of sort of religious divide that occurs in India. So I think that there was that that was my master's thesis, and I became very, I was still toying with the idea of continuing work on gender because I, you know, I I just feel like when you are first introduced to feminist theory in your undergrad, it opens your eyes in so many ways and makes you see the world very differently. I remember um, sitting for a lecture by Nivedita Menon, who's this very renowned feminist in India and political thinker, and she said something that like the global economy would fall apart if women wanted to be paid for their labor. You know, the global economy is structured on the idea that women do unpaid labor, whether it's child rearing, whether uh, caretaking responsibilities, whether it's cooking, whether it's cleaning around the house. Like, that's what would happen if women started demanding money for this. Um, and I was like 17 or 18, and I remember like my brain just like exploding. I think in that moment, and I think that I was interested in the idea of gender specifically, but I also sort of the more writers I examined, thinking about what I want to do my PhD on, I realized I didn't want to just limit my scope to gender for the entire thesis because I felt like there were sort of male writers who obviously also come from a gendered perspective, but who are examining the question of Indo-Muslim identity as well, and I wanted to sort of include them in my thesis. So but the Muslim women writers that I'm looking for in the chapter that I'm almost wrapping up now writing is Khadija Mastoor, Atia Hussain, and Zinat Fateh Ali. So my project, I mean, and there was, and I'm also looking. I hope to also look at Paratla and Haider for another chapter in the thesis. Now, the project, like, I think it's important for us for to sort of say here at the outset, looks at there's this legacy of fantastic progressive women writers like Rashid Jahan or even Isma Chughtai, who I looked at for my master's thesis, but I'm not looking at her necessarily for my PhD. And I am specifically looking at the modernist movement in Indo-Muslim writing that emerged after the progressive writers movement. So the progressive writers were communists, and they or if not outright communists, were interested in seeing literature as a tool for social revolution and reform. uh, and The progressive writers movement emerged out of this, and they definitely had socialist or communist political beliefs, and they came up with fascinating literature that I am very fond of. But I also became interested in the fallout of this, or people who chose to not join the progressive writers movement, or left it uh, midway, and the movement that came out of a sense of disillusionment with the progressive writers movement, but also the partition in general, because the socialist communist utopia of, well, was not possible, but also the logic of, like, say, reform didn't, and nation building did not, it was difficult for people to fully have that confidence in it because the nation had been broken and ripped apart into two. And how do then these Muslim writers make sense of their identity in South Asia, particularly, uh, Muslim writers obviously who choose to stay back in India, or Muslim writers who, Muhajir writers who, Urdu-speaking Muslims who move to Pakistan, and the literature they choose to write about how they narrativize their own identity. And that was interesting to me. So yeah, that's how kind of this project came into being.
What I personally believe that instead of exploring the role of women in development, we should more focus on relationship between women and development, as both are parallel to each other. So, your answer, your words perfectly align or complies with this thing. The next question is, women have to struggle against double discrimination, first because of race and second because of their gender, due to particular political religious system which is hidden but working very actively behind the social system. In your opinion, to what extent political religious systems responsible for such double-edged discrimination against women in South Asia?
So, I mean, I obviously there are, and particularly with the conference that I mentioned earlier that we organized, the symposium, Writing Muslim Women in South Asia, was not just, informative because we were looking at Muslim women writers and stuff, but the confluence of Pakistani scholars, Bangladeshi scholars, diasporic scholars from who are sort of located in the West, but still look at Muslim identity or South Asian Muslim identity. It really brought into focus the the similarities in how Muslim women, in very different political contexts now of Pakistan and say India or Bangladesh, suffer uh, due to the patriarchal sort of oppressive patriarchal norms um, that they exist under. It was interesting to see though that, like, obviously because of the different contexts of these nations, um, they play out differently, and the rationale for how these states or these repressive states choose to govern these identities varies. So obviously in India, what we are seeing right now is sort of with the rise of uh, Mr. Modi and his government, and the Hindutva state, we see a particularly perverse gaze towards Muslim women. And I think, overall in general, I think there is this very, very dangerous, gendered, sexualized interest and in Muslim identity, where the Muslim man, through the love jihad discourse, is seen as like some sort of, uh, you know, seen as someone who can tempt and dis and uh, lie to and deceitfully, like forcibly convert Hindu women, but also is this figure of like uh, very kind of almost like weirdly like hilarious discourse around like his sexuality and sexual prowess and how he can steal Hindu women and he can like give like some extreme sexual pleasure to them and have these like weird like there's if you go down these right wing rabbit holes you'll come across really really weird stuff about Muslim men, and at the same time there is a discourse about Muslim women that ranges from this like weird like oh, we're going to liberate them, getting rid of that with by criminalizing the Muslim male, um, and criminalizing that, making it, making people like, uh, criminals if they choose to do that, or if there is an accusation of that, particularly Muslim men. I think there are dangers in the way this discourse was packaged by the BJP government. And at the same time, for Muslim women, they either become these like Gitari figures who need to be rescued, who need to be emancipated, who need to be modernized, and every sort of every sort of visual marker of their identity is immediately policed. So you see this with the hijab ban in that started in Karnataka and spread like wildfire all over India. You see this with Muslim women. I believe that there was research that was released very recently of Muslim women missing out on job opportunities on a like a cal like a full like a acceptable level, because if they chose to wear a hijab. um, um, and I think that there is it's really dangerous, because we did not see this happen uh 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, even while the Modi government was in power. This discourse, so this sort of seemingly well-meaning discourse of like, we want Muslim women to make their own choices and not be forced to cover their heads, is basically used as a garb for criminalizing and otherizing Muslim women's identity, and represent and visual markers of their identity. At the same time, again, this perverse interest in very prurient narratives about Muslim women's sexuality that you will find on certain corners of the internet get really, really grim. So, for instance, with section with what happened in Kashmir in 2018, with Article 370, uh, there was tweets by uh, lots of like these right wing Hindutva uh, handles about how they can now buy land in Kashmir and marry the fair skinned women of Kashmir, Gori Kashmirans. And there's this, there is this, you see with the rise of things like Sully deals, Bully Buy, these apps where prominent Muslim political and cultural figures, journalists, activists, writers who are sort of well known in the public forum, they were auctioned off to the highest bidder. And it's really grotesque, the way that this is panning out. So I feel like this narrative for we are going to uh, help Muslim women make their own decisions when coming from the right in a certain context is only sort of the tip of the iceberg, and underneath that is just this really perverse interest in conquering in a really deeply patriarchal and like sexist way, the and expressing ownership of Muslim women and their bodies. Um, and I think that there is a clear connection there. So yeah, that's so which comes from, again, as you point out, the double discrimination. There is obviously deeply patriarchal tendencies within our culture, not just tendencies, very patriarchal structures that exist within our culture as they exist in other cultures. But the force of that is sharpened even further because of it, particularly in the Indian context. Um, the matrices of religious identity, caste, class. So much it's much harder to be a working class or lower caste Muslim woman. Very often, because they're facing another level of discrimination, which is not just gender and religion, but also say class or caste, uh, on a daily basis, and frames, and very often those concerns can become more immediate than larger concerns of the nation, or abstract notions of the gender, like just simple ideas about like what they're going to bring to the table to eat, and who's going to give them that. So I feel like there are obviously these different dynamics that need to be examined.
So yeah, with regard to the women being auctioned, my next question is primarily after post-colonial era, men have appropriated the tradition of commodifying or objectifying women in product in various cultures
Yeah.
and locations, including South Asian countries or Indian subcontinent. To what extent patriarchal mindset of societies disadvantaged and psychologically restrained Muslim women in several ways, specifically within India?
I think I think it's I think again I'm thinking about how for Muslim women consistently speaking for themselves has been a problem. Um, because other people consistently want to speak for them. The courts want to speak for them. Liberal, well-meaning, I'm talking about this in the context of India, well-meaning Hindu, upper caste activists want to speak for them, and it's very frustrating because Muslim women themselves are only very slowly sort of taking center stage in the public discourse, and that is um, that's really threatening for I think the Hindutva right wing, because now there is this entire generation of very outspoken, articulate Muslim women activists, and journalists who are doing amazing, really impressive work, and they are terrified of that uh, because it's a Muslim woman who can speak for herself, speak in English, take knows how to use social media. And obviously, you see then this reprisal coming in the form of like, oh, we can't shut them up, we can bully them by making them feel unsafe, and sending rape threats, and God knows what else. Like, I mean, those women have written a lot about it, whether it's Fatma Khan or Rana Ayub or all of these Muslim women, particularly, who are sort of anti, state. Well, a lot of these actions of the state, critical of it. I feel like that has psychologically really affected many Muslim women, and particularly, I think what I found interesting and kind of heartbreaking is a lot of Muslim women rethinking their relationships with, at least in India, with like say Hindu friends and or even family that they have. They might have, and having to have these very difficult conversations with people who, and recognizing that, oh, like, my neighbor who I've grown up with is actually uh, BJP supporter and thinks that everything that Mr. Modi is doing is correct and is right, and probably, likes me as an individual, but will always caveat with, तुम बाप के जैसे थोड़ी हो, like, you're different. You're a different Muslim. You don't seem like a Muslim. Because, and I think that this became a big thing for a lot of Indian Muslims to grapple with, especially those Muslims who could get away with not feeling very or not being seen as very Muslim because they were upper class, because they didn't have visual markers of Muslim identity. Like, so for me, like, like um, I would always hear this growing up where, people would be like, oh, you're Muslim, you don't look like a Muslim. You don't, does your mother wear the hijab or does she wear burqa? Oh, she doesn't. And but at the same time, there are Muslims, who lived in largely sort of Muslim communities in areas, parts like Jamia or things like that in Delhi, or say I grew up in Ranchi, and there's a place called Hindpiri, which is a completely Muslim dominated locality, and for them, like, it is, while their maybe their localities, they might feel somewhat accepted. As soon as they go outside of that, to educational spaces, take public transport, they are, greeted with a hostile glare, if they're choosing to wear a hijab. I remember this really terrifying story of my friend who is actually, a Hindu woman from Karnataka, but was on I think in on the Bangalore metro, and was wearing a green kurta, or like a green kurta, and she was wearing like lots of kohl, because that's just how she dresses, like she was wearing lots of kajal, and was holding a book that was a transliteration of, I think, Ghalib or some other Urdu poet. So it was like there was Urdu on one side and Persian on one side and English on the other. And this man sees her reading this book, wearing a green kurta, which I guess he assumed was a sign that she was Muslim, and getting really angry at her and screaming at her in Kannada, just telling her that you're polluting this place, you're polluting this language. How dare you? And for some reason, he thought that she was not Kannada, she was North Indian or something. I don't know. Maybe she didn't speak the language. But obviously, my friend responded back in perfect Kannada. How dare you speak to me like this? And what are you trying to do? And obviously, but I think that was it can sometimes take very viscerally violent forms. I feel like a lot of Muslims, and every time I go back, so I'm currently obviously in the UK, but every time I go home, I speak to family, I speak to cousins, and they're constantly always worried and stressed. There's a lot of anxiety inside Muslim homes, and you should check in with your Muslim friends if in India particularly, where every piece of news can have a debilitating impact. Like with this whole hijab thing that was happening a couple of months ago, I felt like I couldn't work, I couldn't concentrate on my work because it was affecting me so much. And I was sitting here in the UK. There are people whose daily lives are affected by this on a level, and there are these really heartbreaking clips of teachers, who wear the hijab, being forced to take off their abaya, their hijab before they enter a school, and to make a woman change in full public gaze forcibly because of the power of the state. It's horrific. It's so humiliating. And it's forcing that sort of humiliation on Muslim women. Whereas I've noticed that the situation in Pakistan or Bangladesh is a bit different because here the focus is to sort of strip away the Muslimness from Muslim women. Whereas, from my understanding, in the Pakistani context or in the Bangladeshi context of when we're talking about Muslim women, the focus is to consistently Islamify them. And any variation from their very narrow, limited understanding of a certain kind of uh, Muslim womanhood and Islamic practice that is deeply limited by this sort of almost Salafi understanding of what Islam is, can yeah, so like is really oppressive and difficult for a lot of Muslim women to contend with. And people and Muslim men are the most ruthless implementers of those standards, in these contexts that are deeply oppressive. And like, so the idea of, and I think this is obviously something all Muslim women struggle with, but the template for being a Muslim woman is, there's no set template, and the one that is projected on you, it's limiting, it's patriarchal, it's deeply sexist. There are lots of problems within the community in terms of how Muslim women have to sort of first fight their family members, first fight, um, and then the state. But it's a bit difficult, like this double bind. And I think that there is hope. I mean, there are obviously broader understandings now emerging in these contexts, which is of like recognizing the agency and independence of Muslim women, but still there is a long way to go um, in that fight.
So yeah, with reference to the incident of green kurta, that incident, I would like to share one as well. I recently came across an incident of a murder committed by a Hindu man of a Hindu man. And while he's in interrogation, he justified his act by saying that I misunderstood that man of being a Muslim. So I was like, seriously, his action can be justified for murder that he is a Muslim. So yeah, situation is not very good, but very very bad in India or in other South Asian countries as well. So our next question is, what were the most important challenges that minority women faced during colonial period and are still facing today?
Yeah. Sorry, that's actually really, yeah, that's really depressing, that story. I just wanted to come back to something that, sorry, I forgot to address in your previous question, and I'll sort of respond to the second question as well. Um, this notion of capitalism that you mentioned, and commodification. I, yeah, I'm sorry, I was just thinking that, like, particularly with under capitalism, you see the rise of uh, these narratives with digital media, particularly with social media and stuff, of uh, Muslim women as a particular category and how that's being destabilized. Um, I definitely think that the focus on Muslims very often, even in these liberal left-wing spaces, can be tokenistic as well. Uh, so the representation, so having a Muslim scholar or having a Muslim person, a woman on your panel, the question then just becomes about how we have a Muslim face. And if they say something that maybe questions the privilege of these of these left-wing sort of seemingly hyper-liberal spaces as well, it can cause problems, and people are not ready for that. So I do think that while we have borrowed a lot of American social justice discourse from the US and the social justice movement there, I don't think the standards apply in the same way in the Indian context. And I think that this is a very it's a very almost like a sort of osmosis process under global capitalism, where you take these words that are relevant in the context of, say, African Americans or Latinx communities in America, and you like uncritically transport them on the Indian context and sort of uncritically make, say, uh, uh, think of similarities between, say, race in America and caste in India, or religious identity in India, when it's a bit more complicated. It's a different set of norms and structures that we're talking about. And while it's so important to be inspired, and I'm not saying that like we have to come up, like there's some problem in that process of applying. There's a problem in the idea of applying that. There is in the process that nuance needs to be sort of underlined. And I feel like that's definitely one of those things that I've noticed with this sort of global capitalist discourse, almost, that's like social justice gets like uncritically used in South Asia. But sorry, with the question about colonial, colonial period and still facing today. I think the problems that I pointed out were that I thought about when I thought about this question was sort of speaking for themselves is a problem very often. So, and navigating the binaries between what is oppressed Muslim women and who's the emancipated Muslim woman. And the standards have changed, but like, this, but the central crux of the problem still exists, of like navigating these binaries between emancipation and oppression. And I mean, I can maybe expand a little bit more on this when I come particularly into my research, but this idea of the modern woman, which modern Indian woman, which became a big question for the upper class Indian social reformers of the early 20th century. Um, and a lot of it, obviously, these questions emerge in, say, the Bengali, Brahmo, upper caste Hindu society of colonial India. Um, they were obviously, they were transported, and like these questions became concerns for Muslims in South Asia as well, particularly feudal, wealthy, well-educated Muslims. And recognizing the processes of the creation behind the new Indian woman, or the people like Partha Chatterjee and Tanika Sarkar have done really important work. And I would recommend someone like Shanila Khoja Mulji, whose work in this field has been really useful as well. Gail Minogue, um, uh, a lot of other scholars that I'm probably forgetting, but that thinking about that idea of who the modern woman is, who is Indian, has Indian roots, but Western, like can speak English, and can bake a cake and things like that. So the very limited understanding of what a modern woman is. A modern woman has all the markers of class privilege and Western sort of uh, cultural capital, but you know, is almost in some ways even more conservative when it comes to actually taking control and agency, taking acknowledging the individual woman's agency in a lot of ways. So she should be educated, but not too educated. She should speak English fluently, but she shouldn't exhibit any of the sort of what the social reformers are very concerned about, the sexual freedom that Western women at that point had sort of attained. So none of that. But they should be able to. It's a very interesting. I find it very interesting. And I was actually sort of talking to my mom about it and thinking about it. How did, for so many middle class Indian women, Hindu or Muslim, even or South Asian women, not just Indian women, how did baking become this huge thing? Like, how did women learn to bake and start taking pride in their baking? And it's actually, I have this hunt a very interesting colonial legacy to it in terms of how a woman's identity was forged in colonial South Asia, that she can cook like Western cuisine, and she can, bake Western cakes for to entertain your high flying cosmopolitan friends who might come around. So she becomes a commodity, in a marriage market. That already, I mean, the arranged marriage system has always existed in South Asia, but it modified the caste, class, uh, sort of based very traditional marriage market into like a more modern day uh, market, a finance, like almost like a economically determined market where the woman was offering certain goods and wares, and that was those were being sold to the highest bidder. And this I think another thing was sort of yeah. So I think these issues still take form and continue today as well, in terms of what the problems were that we are facing during the colonial era for as Muslim women, and are facing now. Obviously, they take different forms in independent nations, and I can come to that later. But yeah.
Okay, so the next question is: in most of her novels, Anita Desai holds a vision that middle class women in contemporary India strive to overcome societal limitations. Moreover, Muslim women in India stand on entirely different ground, facing societal limitations at double level. What can be done to create an equal ground for women irrespective of caste, religion, or race?
So, I think that's it's interesting that you talk about Anita Desai. Because Anita Desai wrote the introduction to Sunlight on a Broken Column when it was published again, which is the book that kind of started all of this. So, yeah, definitely, I think this idea of uh, there's vanishing space for who the modern Muslim woman is. She was in colonial times sort of a problematic and marginal figure, problematic because she came from a place of privilege, and but was still widely seen and understood But maybe because of, at least in the Indian context, and even in, even in Pakistan, with the partition, with the large-scale migration of well-off Muslims to Pakistan, feudal Muslim, like lords to Pakistan and things like that, uh, the idea of who the modern Muslim woman was somewhere lost in I would say from the late 40s to what we now see is a resurgence, and images of radical Muslim activists and leaders, like people like Aisha Rana, uh, Gulafsha Fatima, or Safura Zargar, who faced the most vitriolic right wing attacks against her because she was, married and pregnant, but somehow the right was very interested in making up stories about her uh, uh, pregnancy. And it's really stressful and worrying how and how perverse and disgusting this discourse is. And you know, it's I think there were this idea of home and belonging, which particularly say the writers that I'm looking at in my thesis, whether it is um, Zinat Fateh Ali or Khadija Mastoor or Atia Hussain, this idea of recognizing the home as a space where you have a lot of attachment to it because there is intimacy, there is a relationship that you share with your family members, but also recognizing it as a site of oppression, and which is why feminist politics begins at the home, uh, at the first level, is what opportunities parents choose to offer to their daughters, and how they recognize that if their daughters might disagree with them or take decisions that they don't agree with. I feel like this is very common in South Asian households that, like, parents pride themselves on being modern because they uh, are educating their daughters and letting them work and letting them do whatever they want, but that's because that's what they want their daughters to do. It's when she chooses to do something that they would disagree with, some small thing like wear a short skirt, to a big thing like choose her own partner. uh, that's when the problem arises. Obviously, you're letting her do what, this whole idea of like I'm giving her my daughter freedom or letting her do what she wants to do. Um, it's only because you want her to do that, as a parent. So I think sort of the most important step would be in the home to recognize the children as individuals who have different aspirations from their parents. And this independence then needs to sort of, of course, education is important, but an education doesn't just merely mean getting a degree. An education means developing critical thinking and your own independent thinking. So I feel like that's key in building, helping women overcome the patriarchy, and giving them, and giving them an education and allowing them to be financially independent, to then have, uh, whatever you want to call it, like reproductive freedom, sexual freedom, romantic freedom. I think like this emphasis in South Asian society of choosing a partner who comes from the correct caste, class, background it's very, very religious background. It can be it's very limiting to people's freedoms very often. um, and I think recognizing that, is and is very important. I think also for a lot of Muslim women, the faith itself, Islam, is filled with positive Muslim women, like role models, like as I was talking, listening to stories, when they would recite stories of Marcia and Noha and Majlis about the Karbala. Like I was very inspired by someone like Bibi Zainab when I was, listening to stories of about her and her wisdom and fortitude and resilience. Fatima, Zehra Salvatullah. Like there are all of these figures within the faith itself who can be galvanized and seen as feminist role models, which they undoubtedly were. And sort of telling young Muslim girls about these very independent, strong women is very important, and hoping that they can sort of replicate some of that. But also excavating, and the symposium was a very small attempt to try and do that. But there is this v- very underrepresented and undervalued history of Muslim women writers and reformers who we need to go back to and think about how far ahead from their time they were. Like if you read Khadija Mastoor, now it's the most searing critique of of patriarchal familial structures. Ismat Chughtai, reading Atya Hussain, reading Zeenat Fateh Ali, like all of the Qurrat Alain Haider, Rashid Jahan. There is, and contemporary like names like Kamala Shamsi. Um, I remember I once gave a presentation on Begum Rokea's Sultana's Dream as a part of my master's like class, and this was in Cambridge. I was surrounded by people who had never heard of her, had no idea about this short story and why it's considered important, but had lots of experience reading science fiction from Western uh, women writers. And there's this people like Margaret Atwood or Ursula Le Guin. Like there's this huge like legacy of feminist science fiction. And this short story called Sultana's Dream, which you may or may not have heard of, but if you probably have, is basically a very early science fiction text which imagines something called, I think it's called Ladyland. This is a world for women where men are in parda and women are outside and free and kind of, and it's so, she talks about this story that came out in like a 1910 or something, talks about things like solar energy, talks about thinking about reproduction, like communal raising of children. It talks about, I think, thinking about, developing technology that takes away the labor pains, or something like that, I believe, or like, transferring that reproductive labor onto a machine. And it's and I remember the class, just like all of these very like predominantly white students just being stunned that this came out of a Bengali Muslim woman's pen from in the early 1900s, like decades before people like Ursula Le Guin or Shulamit Firestone, the very important radical feminists in in the Western world decades before that. And it's really important to think about these women writers and their voices, but also just sort of, I was so impressed by Miss Marvel. I recently finished watching it, and I feel like contemporary role models like that, shows like that, can insert such a sense of confidence and representation and being seen, not just for Muslim, young Muslim girls, but also just brown-skinned women, seeing that in the culture can be so uplifting, because it's not just merely a tokenistic representation of like, okay, we now have a Muslim woman superhero as well, but it's actually a very well told story, that is, I think, very conscious and sort of very lovingly and carefully engages with its context. With its diasporic and sort of South Asian context. So yeah, definitely having more narratives, or having like that are contemporary, while also revisiting our history of Muslim women writers. I mean, I'm speaking about it as someone who does literature, but also activists, reformers, political thinkers. Yeah. I think that's very important to sort of talk about them as much as we can.
I haven't watched the series yet, but was planning to watch it. So
You
surely,
must.
review. Sure. I will surely watch it. So yeah, that was it. Thank you so much, Zahra, for your time and for making such a thoughtful and resourceful discussion. I seriously hope to keep in touch with you and to collaborate with you and with the organization in future ahead. So till then, good luck to you and your projects and efforts. Goodbye.
Thank you so much, Rimsha. It was such a delight to talk to you, and you very patiently listened to everything I've said. It was thank you so much for your very thoughtful questions, and yeah, apologies in case I have like misquoted something or missed saying something, but or was rambling. But yeah, no, it's been an absolute pleasure, and of course, I'd love to keep in touch with you, and people who might be watching it.
It really indeed was worth talking with you, and your thoughts were really mind opening, and I thank you for making such discussion.
Thank you. That is very, very generous and kind of you. Thank you, Rimsha.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Goodbye.